Hi, I'm Margaret Beetham, and I'm going to be talking about the untold story of missionary children. And the title of my paper is Home is Where. In 1855, the British Mothers magazine published a poem describing the anguish of the missionary mother saying goodbye to the children which she was leaving behind in Britain as she sailed to distant lands where she and her husband were working. She'd be separated from her children for many years and by many miles. The magazine in which this poem appeared was one of several developed in Britain in the 1850s, which pioneered giving advice on how to bring up children in middle-class Victorian households. It was linked to the maternal associations of evangelical churches. It was serious, unillustrated, and published not only articles, but letters from mothers sharing accounts of child rearing and family life. It was a distant ancestor you might think of Mumsnet, though very different in tone. This magazine, with one or two others like it, therefore, pioneered in print that middle-class commitment to women being homemakers and mothers, which came to dominate domestic arrangements and women's social place in Victorian Britain, and still does, I think. The exhortation with which the poem ends, calling on other mothers to follow her example and sacrifice their children for a higher Christian calling, may therefore seem contradictory. However, against the powerful ideology of women as mothers, the magazine, deeply rooted in evangelical Christianity, set a higher commitment to the service of God. My question here is, where can we find the voice of the child? Though the Mothers magazine did from time to time print letters from missionary wives, and sometimes they spoke about separation from their children, they were more often about the schools that the missionary wives had set up, or accounts of reading copies of the magazine with those they called their sable sisters. Missionary children were an absent present. I can't even find a poem which imaginatively recreates the child's experience as the opening poem does the mother's. Where is the child's voice to be heard? In his 4-volume history of the Church Missionary Society, published in 1902, Eugene Stock argued that the missionary family's role was to preach the gospel by the exhibition of the purity and beauty of the Christian home. By implication, this meant setting an example to those whose domestic life was perceived as disordered or immoral. However, according to the scholar Emily Mantelos and her extensive research on the London Missionary Society records, Stock's rather bland assertion concealed decades of argument about missionary families within the societies. In the late 18th and early 19th century, missionary societies had refused to allow any women to go in the mission field at all, despite many, many applications. However, by the 1830s, missionaries were allowed to marry, missionaries by definition being men. The arguments then were about how the education and upkeep of the resulting children was to be managed and financed. Stock also, Mantlo argues, and I think rightly, smooths over the contradictions inherent in setting up as ideal those families where, contrary to the domestic ideology exemplified in the Mothers magazine, mothers, the wives, almost always worked outside home, running schools and Bible classes, and they also failed to discharge their primary duty as mothers because they sent their children away to school. Mantlo argues that in spite of these contradictions, the weight of moral scrutiny on children in these families was systemic. And this was particularly acute because children were often more fluent and at ease in the languages and customs of the country than their parents were. And in any case, they were simultaneously immersed in two quite different cultures, the heathen culture of the country they were living in and a home culture where aspects of British middle-class manners and norms tended to be seen as morally superior or even inherently Christian. It was better to eat with a knife and fork than with your fingers, for example. Mantlo's research ends in the 1850s, and she draws very much from official documents, particularly as they relate to the South Seas and South Africa. So it's limited to that extent. But she opens up some really important questions about the experience of missionary children in a range of dates and countries, I would argue up until the late 20th century. Her book still leaves me, though, with the question how to find out how children understood the potentially conflicted situations in which they found themselves. I'm a historian of print culture, and particularly of the periodical press in the long 19th century, including in the extensive range of journals and magazines missionary societies produced, many of them for children. But I am also the product, some might say the survivor, of that particular historical formation of childhood inscribed in the Mother's Magazine poem. That organization of families and childhood persisted from the early 19th century through until the late 20th century. I'm the child of British Christian missionaries. I was brought up in India. I was first sent to boarding school at 7, but then I was separated from my parents and younger siblings to go to school in Britain when I was 12, and never rejoined my family until they returned to the UK after I'd left school. In this, I followed in the footsteps of my mother, who had also been the child of missionary parents. Born in India in 1907, she was sent back to Britain, aged 7, to go to Walthamstow Hall School in Kent, a boarding school founded in 1838 for the daughters of missionaries. And it was to this same school, in the same building, not this one, but the one that was built slightly later, that I was sent with my younger sister in 1951-52. My mother's best friend, who also went out to India as a missionary in the 1930s, was the third generation of missionary women in her family, and her mother had been sent to the same school in this same building that you see on the slide in the 1880s. How are we to read this long and continuous history? There are, of course, as you will all know from your research, systemic reasons why children's experience, as against the formal accounts of that experience, is difficult to find. And not only in the era when the ideology that children should be seen and not heard prevailed. I was brought up in a family where children were encouraged to be heard as well as seen, but I found it impossible to talk about, or perhaps even to think about, my childhood for much of my adult life. Most of my friends never knew that I'd been brought up in India. When the sister who'd been closest to me and with whom I'd shared that childhood experience most fully died 15 years ago, I began to write about my childhood, first of all for my own children and grandchildren. And then 2 years ago, when I was 80, I published a book about my childhood called Home is Where, The Journeys of a Missionary Child, in which I wrote about the experiences I'd shared with my siblings and with countless others, but which I had never really been able to talk about. And for reasons that I suppose are linked with that, I mostly wrote it in the third person, even though it's an autobiography. As a result of this book, I've received letters from others, mostly women and men in their 70s and 80s, and sometimes 90s, who recognized what I'd spoke and offered me snatches of their own histories. They spoke of the richness of being brought up in two cultures, but also of the bewilderment and sense of utter loss and abandonment many of them felt of being separated at an early age, not only from their parents, but from the world they knew, to be sent off to a strange place which their parents called home, but which their children never did. Most just thanked me for telling a story which they shared, and some said it made them cry. One man born in Calcutta in 1934 wrote to me at some length. He said his father had worked in Calcutta, but he went on, I can relate to your experience, even though mine was in Calcutta and Darjeeling. I can also relate to your experience, shock, when you first arrived back in England. I have poor memories of the time before I was sent to Darjeeling, age 6 in 1940. Put on a train in Calcutta for the overnight school train to Siliguri, about 300 miles, and then up to the hills at Darjeeling, 6,500 feet, on another train the next day. The school I went to was St. Joseph's College. As this correspondence shows, missionary children were expected from a young age to be extraordinarily independent, undertaking long journeys, for example, unaccompanied by parents, or any adult known to them. Some acquired skills in moving, not just between places, but between cultures and languages. However, this was not true for all of them, and for those who did, I think it was at a cost. The writer concludes, I have often wondered if the trauma of separation from my parents wiped many of my early memories. The loss of memory caused by trauma may be one reason why the voices of those who've been children of missionaries are hard to find. But that makes for me more urgent the question of historical sources. Where are the voices to be heard? Where are the archives of missionary children's lives? Recently, within that interdisciplinary area where literary studies meets historical studies, in which I've done my academic work, there's been a turn to the questioning of the archives. Caroline Steedman, for example, in her book Dust, brings the idea of the archive as a repository of disembodied knowledge into contact with the time, place, and embodied experience of the working woman who's working in the archive, a woman who uses her own life experience as a working class child to intervene into 20th century histories of childhood. Questions about how to access the histories of those groups who have been systematically silenced has been the concern not only of those interested in class and gender, like Steedman, but also by post-colonial scholars and those exploring the histories of enslaved people. Scholars like Jenny Sharp argue that we should draw on a range of different kinds of texts, song, poetry, and other texts to understand the history of these groups who did not have access to the official archive and whose voices were not heard. It would, of course, be wrong to equate the lives of relatively privileged white missionary children with that of enslaved people in the US, or those in the British colonies, whose lives were so unregarded that even their deaths to protect Britain in war were not deemed worthy of marking. However, I suggest that to explore the life of the missionary child in the context of those wider histories of colonialism and migration which shape our contemporary world, we need a range of sources to complement the minutes and formal reports of the missionary societies. These include print ephemera like magazines, family letters, photos and emails, stories of lives recounted sometimes orally, school histories, and even perhaps fiction like Barbara Kingsolver's The Poisonwood Bible. So letters first. It's difficult to overestimate the significance of personal letters in missionary contexts, including for children, at least until the late 20th century. Missionaries had to write regularly back to those in Britain who funded their work. But besides that, and in the absence of those modern forms of communication like email, phone, and mobile, personal letters between missionaries and their children and wider family were the only way of keeping in touch over the years. When I was at boarding school in Kent and my parents were in India during the 1950s, my mother wrote to us every week, and we schoolgirls had to sit on our beds every Sunday afternoon in silence and write letters to our parents until a bell rang to release us. Our lives were controlled by bells, particularly the times when we had to be silent, which were many. I continued the practice of weekly letter writing to my parents long after leaving school. At least for us, an airmail letter might arrive within perhaps 2 weeks. For my mother and her generation, letters to India might take weeks or even months to arrive. So an answer to a childish question might come long after you had forgotten what it was that you asked. Still, these letters were often treasured and kept over the years, evidence of children's experiences, if we can find them, even though we may know that the accounts that are given are likely to be self-centered, if not formally vetted. When my parents left their retirement home to go into sheltered housing, they gave each of their children
how's your homework going, if you have any?
A bundle of letters that we'd written them from school. My sister promptly threw hers in the bin. I put mine into an old cabin trunk where they molded away until I took them out recently. They are, of course, unreliable. Children want to protect their parents from the truths of their lives. However, that too is a kind of evidence. Schools also and school histories provide a kind of evidence, and a related archive can be found in the magazines and histories of the various schools set up for missionary children. The vexed question of what kind of education to give their children, missionaries sometimes solved by educating them at home, but very often they set up schools in the countries where they worked. These schools were in effect segregated, although not formally so. That is, they weren't usually open to the population, to the wider population, despite the fact that missionaries set up and ran schools as very much as part of their general work. All these schools provided long-term boarding and were situated often in favorable locations, like the hill station, where the school to which I went from when I was 7 to 12 was in South India. Their parents might come up in the cool season, or the school in Britain that I went to. Equivalent British schools in the colonies or in the mission station usually went up to the equivalent of junior school or infant school because, unlike Americans, British missionaries sent their children back home at 11 or 12. Unlike them, American and European missionaries often kept their children in the country with them until they had graduated from school. And I think that made a substantial difference to the experience of missionary children. Although, as I'll show in a minute, perhaps not that much difference, but still leaving home when you're 18 is different from leaving home when you're 7 or 8 or 9 or 10. Along with all these, there are formal and informal accounts of lives recorded in later life. The autobiographies of missionaries, alongside formal lives, were well-established publishing genres in the 19th century and into the 20th, but these tended to be about public and private, not private life, and were mostly written by and about famous men. However, I'm not alone in deciding in old age to try to tell the story of my childhood experience. Most of these accounts, however, are informal, circulating as stories in families or sometimes as typed up mini autobiographies, like the family history written in her old age by my mother's best friend, who, as I already mentioned, was the last of the missionary dynasty. In reading her typescript, I found she was sent to my old school, Walthamstow Hall, in the 1880s. And the only comment about school which she made was that it was very strict. However, it's revealing that when the time came for her to send her own children to school, she decided to stay in Britain and not send them to boarding school, but sent her husband back to India on his own until her children had left school. I recently initiated an online correspondence with a group of alumni of the school I attended in India, asking them about their experiences of school. And as a result, I have received a wealth of information and detail, both personal and institutional. One of them wrote to me that missionary schools were a huge improvement on the earlier times when missionaries, like somebody whose name I find hard to pronounce, but I think it's Adoniram Judson, the pioneer of Baptist missionaries, saw his children once in 50 years. These schools may have been a huge improvement, but there were still issues for missionary children when they eventually left the country where they'd been educated and went home. And many of these emails from my American correspondents show this. They tell me stories of happy times, but also of near breakdowns, usually among their friends, and of feeling they belonged neither in the culture of their childhood, nor in the countries their parents called home. The term third culture kids was a formulation of this. For the most part, missionary children were resilient. These third culture kids often developed social skills and coping mechanisms, which taught them to fit in anywhere, but they often viewed their social milieu at a distance and frequently looked to their earliest years abroad as home. So wrote one of my correspondents from the States, Dave Dickerson. In this age of forced as well as voluntary migration, many children share the sense of displacement that missionary children felt. For missionary children, it was a core experience. Hence the title of my book, Home is Where, The Journeys of a Missionary Child. Hence the search to hear some of these other voices. Thank you.